I would like now to call upon, somebody said a helicopter. She is not a helicopter. She is an eminent scientist, long-term global change scientist, and long-term IIASA ally friend, Jill Jäger. We have seen Jill already summarizing for us in an excellent way in Hofburg, day number 1. And this morning you were expecting Jill to be on stage. And then I made a fatal mistake, which I thought was fatal, because I forgot simply to invite her onto stage. We were so carried away by testimony of Rolf Neuker. And then I said, well, let's take disadvantage into advantage. Let's sort of have her helicopter view actually synthesizing 2 days, right? So we are still friends, Jill, despite this morning, and she's coming now stage to give us, in her excellent way, the summary of 2 days of this conference. Jill, the floor is yours.
It's not true. I'm not going to do 2 days. I'll do 3. And I'm not going to go through the long summary that I wrote for yesterday's events. It will appear. It will be part of the documentation of the meeting. If we look back to both days, on the first day we saw a lot about the challenges of the transformation in the human environment system. And when I hovered around in my helicopter, I was looking both at the ideas about transformation and system change, but I was also looking at what we were saying about this human environment system, whether it's just about the people side, just about the environment side, or about the coupling between. And I also tried to sort of tease out what the messages were for research, for the other side, the sort of policy action side, and then for the interface between them. Yesterday we moved more to discussing, first of all, some really interesting issues related to inequality, and what the challenges are of tackling that inequality and supporting development while at the same time respecting the planetary boundaries. And I think very important from a sustainability point of view, and was pointed out extremely clearly yesterday, was that we have to recognize that this is a global issue, that we have to remember the statement that was made yesterday: we are all in this together. And that means that the co-design of the research in this particular case means the co-design by the rich and the poor. And that has a lot of implications for research approaches that we're taking. So overall, on days 1 and day 2, we saw the need for the new scientific approaches. We came out to IIASA, and what we really want to see now is what does this day tell us about those new approaches? Which ones are already starting? Which ones do we already begin to understand what the problems are and what the challenges are? And there are 3 things that I think we've heard today, 3 areas where we can discuss those new approaches. But for me to tell you about that, I couldn't be in 4 parallel sessions at one time. I couldn't be in 5 parallel sessions at one time. So I'm really grateful to the rapporteurs. We've been sitting together after the sessions and trying to just tease out a few key messages and really trying not to be comprehensive. I don't have time for that. And anyway, there'll be reports available from the meeting, but to try and pull out a few elements of the discussion so that you get a flavor for what day 3 is telling us about meeting the challenges that we posed on days 1 and 2 of the conference. So the first thing that we have been told about today is about the tools that we can use to look at the human environment system and with which we can begin to tease out some of the synergies and the trade-offs between multiple objectives. And those multiple objectives were very clear from the first 2 days of the conference. So there are 3 sessions that actually contribute to that piece of information. The first one was on integrating models of socio-ecological systems, where on the one hand we could see there are methods, there are some case studies that exist which have transcended the normal sort of very narrow disciplinary boundaries that are beginning to integrate across them. But on the other hand, more examples are needed. We need to build up the set of information on what those approaches are, what works, what doesn't work. On the other hand, although we've got the beginnings and in fact quite a lot of progress in some areas on integrating models, the challenge that we faced and that came very clear on the first day of the conference of we are living in a world that is it's undergoing traumatic changes, as Ban Ki-moon said. Where are we, and we need transformations, where are the models that can really help us begin to understand and look at the implications of those transformational change? We're talking then, when we talk about transformational change, about non-linearities, about thresholds, and a lot of the approaches that we have used in the past 20 years will not be very useful for the transformational side of the question. There was evidence of the early stages of developing models and approaches that handle this, that can deal with this transformational challenge, including the use of historical proxies. But we see that as a particular area where more work is going to be urgently needed very soon. The second session that was in this area of what tools do we have was discussing the synergies and trade-offs among multiple sustainable development objectives. We saw there that this is a really difficult area. It's difficult to define goals because of the fact that there are multiple objectives. And it's not only difficult to define the goals, it's difficult to achieve them. We also heard about the risks and uncertainties within sustainable development policies and the fact that investments in achieving goals have declined as the risks have increased. And last but not least, because we were talking about the ideas of synergies and trade-offs, it was pointed out very clearly that science does have an important role to play here. There's an important role for scientists to play in helping to define goals, that have multiple objectives, define them, to analyze, to point out what these synergies and trade-offs are. We've seen lots of evidence of that in the first 2 days, to make proposals for solutions and strategies, but also to evaluate the outcomes. And the third area that is in this sort of topic area of the tools that we've got available to meet the challenges that we've been addressing all week is on optimal versus suboptimal solutions, a session that was held this afternoon. And there's 2 really important messages there. The first one is about the need for a plurality of voices that can deal with these wicked problems, the ones that I referred to on the first day as persistent problems of unsustainability, but also to deal with uncomfortable knowledge, of which we've also heard quite a lot, and clumsy solutions. And secondly, if we move into the sort of the title of that session on optimal versus suboptimal, the point was raised that when we talk about optimization, we need to have goals. And when we're talking about sustainability, we have some long-term goals, and there can, of course, be short-term goals, but they're not always the same. And so we have a problem with saying, well, what's optimal? And the one good starting place would be, in fact, the places where these long-term and short-term goals match. And that would be a place to begin the dialogue about the solutions. Okay, so that was the first area. That was the tools that we have to deal with the challenges. The second focus of today that has come up in two sessions, one this morning and one this afternoon, indicates something that came out in my summary of day one as well, which is this focus on ecosystems. Systems, but ecosystems. So we had a session this morning on securing ecosystem services, where it was shown that there is a big importance of cross-sectoral integration, but there are still barriers to that integration. There's a barrier because there are still people who question the need for it. There was a lot of discussion also about the importance, even if we're talking about ecosystem services, not to only focus on the eco bit of that, but to introduce social indicators. And interestingly, there was a discussion then about, since it was on food and water in particular as ecosystem services, with respect to ecosystem services, that we've talked a lot over the course of the first 2 days of the meeting about the supply side. Is there enough food supply? But that in fact, we need to focus a lot more of our discussion on the demand side. And interestingly, I was in the first bit of a session this afternoon on another topic, but where that point was raised also for energy. So a move to think not just about the supply side, but a real good think about the demand side, about consumption, and about sustainable consumption. And the second session that talked about ecosystems was then about how to meet needs in the face of the pressure on ecosystems. And there I think a lot of the focus, if I sum it up, from what I heard, was on communication. There was an introduction about the newly founded International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS, which some people said they had not heard about until today. And so there was a question, why isn't this as widely known as IPCC? Well, of course, IPCC has a much longer history, but we need to get it as well known as say, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The second thing is that there was a discussion about once we know what needs to be implemented, how do we actually get the implementation done in this area of ecosystem services and the fact that we're dealing with them when they're under pressure. And it was pointed out that there's many examples of things that could be done that don't even cost very much or maybe cost nothing. So an approach that would start working with those, but then think through the whole issue of scaling them up. And last but not least, there was a discussion in that group also about sustainable development goals. So 2 sessions that have tackled this issue from different perspectives. There is already a lot of quantification of ecosystem services, although there are still a lot of gaps. But that information about what we do know about ecosystem services and the quantification side is not as widely disseminated as perhaps it should be. On the other hand, there are some services that it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to quantify, for example, cultural services, and a need overall, therefore, to think through the quantification, but also what we do with the qualitative value of ecosystem services. Okay, so the third area that we had one session on today was the green economy, where it was pointed out that the green economy concept could be helpful, but a lack of definition is causing a lot of confusion. Here again, some focus needed on qualitative growth and not quantitative growth, and major bottlenecks to achieving this, largely because the incentives aren't there. At the end, there was also a point made that there's a need for a much greater focus on changes of values. So again, back to this question about the demand side and not just the supply side, that this getting a change of focus to changes of values is probably longer term, but we won't get there unless we start setting the incentives now and providing incentives, but also education and information to make it easier to start a refocus onto changes of values. Okay, in addition to ecosystems and the green economy and technological options, we've also been looking at the combination of the two, so technological change and behavioral change, and again return to a topic that was very strong on the first day of the conference, the role of human capital and the role of humans in managing our planet and managing risks. We learned a lot in the session this morning on education, human capital, and vulnerability, about the different levels and perspectives of vulnerability research that have to be taken into account, different scale levels, for examples. We also discussed cognition. We were introduced to the idea of testing using immediate word recall, and I did begin to wonder after 3 days of conference how well I would do on that test of could I remember 10 words within the next minute. Not too sure about that at all. But this showed, in fact, the value of investments in education and nutrition for building cognitive potential of societies, and we already saw on day one that that's an essential element for transformations that we are talking about. And finally, we discussed in that session the responsibility of scientists to communicate with understandable language. So when we're talking about human capital, also getting our messages over, this was kicked off by the implications of the Italian verdict this week. And we went on to discuss, for example, how the term GDP is communicated, what we think we're communicating with that word, and what other people hear when they hear it. So perhaps the need to convey to the world, for example, that GDP is not an adequate measure of progress, a message that we don't seem to be very consistent in getting out. And there was another session then that also picked up on the social and technological solutions, although it was pointed out that by titling it Social versus Technological Solutions, we were either trying to be provocative or it was the wrong title. But there was a lot of discussion there, also again about the importance of dialogue for transformation, about the importance of policy instruments that can help form social norms that then feed into the demand for technology. So again, linking the two, not seeing them as two completely separate domains. A barrier in changing demand, in changing demand is clear that in some cases the public wants change, but we don't have a framework there in order for that to take place. And then, again, this tension between telling stories or dealing with issues from the production side or from the consumption side. Last but not least, the session on the science policy gap, where I have two notes on points that were raised there, but I think the notes from the session as a whole will tell you that there was a broad variety of topics covered. So the importance of knowing the policy question and who the players are, including and knowing also the things like the economic and societal costs, to know as much as possible before addressing policy actors. But in doing that, also to be aware that it's really important to know the context within which you are talking, not just the policy context. There's a broad set of contextual factors that play a role for this bridging to be functioning well, and to ensure engagement of a wide set of stakeholders, including the citizens. What do I miss? What's needed? What didn't I hear when people came and reported back to me? This might be that they forgot to tell me that this was a really important point in the session. But I didn't hear today a lot of discussion about something that was raised on the first 2 days in terms of a need, which was the whole issue of stakeholder engagement in framing the problems, in discussing the trade-offs, in experimenting with the solutions. I didn't hear a lot about process design, how to embed these systems analysis tools into the iterative processes of dialogue with the stakeholders, and therefore into transformational processes. And I didn't hear anything about place-based research that would be using systems analysis tools embedded in a long-term process of transition to sustainability. But finally, let me close by giving you a sneak preview of IIASA's 50th anniversary conference in 2022. Given the transformations that have taken place in the intervening 10 years, and we've heard a lot about them here, the 2022 conference will not have many presentations. It will focus on dialogue. Not everyone will be in Vienna or Luxembourg. ICT will bring regional dialogues. Of the few presentations that there will be, half of them will be by stakeholders. Half of them will be by young people. And half of them will be by women. The rest of the sessions will be designed using innovative participatory processes that are themselves transformative. Thank you.